Hello, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Kate, and I work in the marketing team at Aptem. Before I hand over to Tony and Freya to introduce themselves, I want to draw your attention to a couple of housekeeping items. First of all, we will be recording this session, and everyone who has registered will receive a copy by email in the coming days. Please feel free to share this with your colleagues. You're muted throughout the webinar, so if you do need assistance, please use the chat function in the right-hand panel. You can also ask questions in the questions section of that panel, and we'll get to as many of these as we can at the end of the webinar. We hope you enjoy the webinar, and at this point, I will hand over to Tony.
Thank you, Kate. Thanks very much indeed. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Tony Allen. I'm an independent consultant running my own company, which I've been doing for the last 7 years, advising companies and training providers with all aspects of apprenticeships, from governance to quality, and very much around today's theme of compliance. Prior to that, I was a senior civil servant for 14 years in the Department for Education. Freya.
Thanks, Tony. My name's Freya and I'll be supporting Tony today. I'm a product owner here at Aptem, and I'll be doing a couple of high-level demos of how Aptem can support you in preparing for audit. They won't be super detailed, they'll be very high level, but we have lots and lots of webinars on our help centre if you wanted to get into more of the detail of how to create reviews and action some of the things we're going to be talking about today. So I'll hand back over to you, Tony, and we can get started.
Great, thanks so much indeed. So if we can have the first slide, thanks very much. So today's webinar is about preparing for the dreaded DSFA audit using Aptem. And Freya and I are going to be talking about specifically how to prepare for the audit, what the auditors will be looking for, what you need to be doing from now really, and not waiting for you to get the email or the phone call to say they're coming. And specifically then how you can use Aptem to help you prepare for that audit. As Kate said at the beginning, there will be time for questions at the end, so please be very forthcoming with your questions. There is no such thing as a bad question or a silly question, so please, I would encourage you to pose those as we go along. Thanks, Kate. So, okay, let's move on to the next slide. So the first thing that's really important is that we take a step back from the audit itself and we have a look at your overall approach to compliance. I work with quite a lot of training providers and have done over the last 7 years, and even prior to that in my time in the department. And I'm always fairly surprised at the number of organizations that, yes, have an approach to compliance, but it's not planned. It sort of just happens. They know they need to check off the job hours. They know they need to check eligibility. They know they need to check around IAG and RPL and all of that stuff. But there isn't a plan. And the first thing I would encourage you organizationally to do is to set out your approach to compliance in what I call a compliance framework or compliance plan. And that needs to cover a number of things. So first of all, how will you ensure that you're compliant? What is it that you're going to do that will make sure that if someone were to come in like an agency auditor and look at the evidence requirements that are clearly set out in the funding rules, you would have all of that evidence. You will be able to show an auditor that you were compliant. Who's responsible for compliance in the organizations, in your organization? Who makes those decisions around what you need to do? Who's involved? It shouldn't all just be left to the person who has compliance in their job title. I'll talk about this a little bit later, but compliance is a shared responsibility across the whole business. What's your approach to sampling? If you're going to be doing your own internal auditing, and I strongly recommend that you do, a number of providers I've worked with don't. I think that's a mistake. You need to be organizing your own internal review of your compliance. Is it random? Is it entirely random? So if you're looking at your learners, do you select them at random, or is there some form of risk-based approach? Have you some assessors, for example? Have you some IQAs who are perhaps not as good at spotting things as others? Do they have a higher risk rating, and therefore do you look at more of their learners? Things like that you need to be thinking about. How many learners are you going to sample? You know, are you going to look at 1%, 5%, 20%, or will that vary depending upon the theme, whether we're looking at off the job or prior learning or eligibility, or again, back to this risk-based approach. And I want to encourage you to think about a risk-based approach, because you know, you can spend a lot of time looking and reviewing things that are fine, and you don't want to be doing that. I won't ever describe that as a waste of time, because you always learn things, but clearly your focus needs to be on those learners, on those coaches, tutors or assessors, whatever you call them in your business, on those IQA people who perhaps are at, present most risk to you. So have a think about that. And make sure that this plan enshrines a strategy for dealing with identified non-compliance. How are you going to put it right? What is it that you're going to ask your tutors, your assessors, whoever, your learners themselves, to do when you identify a problem? So the plan needs to articulate those type of things, and it's really important that you have one. It's also quite good that when you are contacted by the agency, that you can present this plan, show it to the auditor, and it just gives them that extra feel of confidence that you know what you're doing when it comes to compliance. Thanks, Kate. So one of the first key things I will always say is read the funding rules. Now, you know, that falls into the obvious category of things to do, but you will be surprised how many people have probably never read the funding rules from cover to cover. Now, it's not a riveting read, I accept that. A lot of people think they know them. There is, trust me, a lot of misinformation out there about what is and what is not acceptable. And there are still, whilst the funding rules over time have become a lot better, a lot clearer, and I will give the agency credit for that, there are still some aspects of the funding rules that are not clear. So make sure you read them. Don't rely on what's on LinkedIn or a general overview you might pick up from somebody, because it may be wrong. You know, I constantly come across, I've been working with the funding rules for 15 years. I constantly come across people who have been given advice that is just wrong. So there is no substitute for immersing yourself in them. Refer to them frequently. I always have a copy of the funding rules for the last 3 years open on one of my screens on my second laptop, always, because I'm always getting asked questions and things that sometimes I have to go back to and just check specific words. Yeah, check whether it says must or should. Check whether it means the practical period end date or the period end date. In other words, the absolute end of the apprenticeship or just the end of the practical period. Things like that. Individual words in the funding rules are important. If you're not clear about something, I would urge you to go to the help desk, the ESFA help desk. It's had a bad reputation in the past. In my experience in the last year, they have got a lot better. And you know, it is certainly your first port of call. You will sometimes get the response, read the funding rules. And it's very frustrating when you get that response because that's what you've done and you don't understand it. But that is worth doing initially. And don't be afraid to ask an expert. You know, there are people out there who you can ask and seek advice from. The final thing I'll say is establish your position in cases of ambiguity. What I always used to say to providers when I was in the department, and I still say to them now, is this: go to the help desk, ask a question. If you don't understand the answer or they don't answer, tell them they haven't answered. Give them 2 opportunities to answer your question. If they still haven't, or they're just telling you to read the rules, that probably means they don't know. And there are aspects of the funding rules that the agency have not particularly thought through. And what you should then do is to email them back and say, I've asked you this question twice. You have not answered it. So therefore, we are going to interpret it in this way. And give them the opportunity to come back and tell you you're wrong. If they don't, keep that email. If an auditor walks through the door and says, why have you done this? Why have you interpreted this in this way? Show them that email trail. Evidence is a key word with compliance. We'll talk about it a lot in a minute, but absolutely make sure that you document, you have an audit trail, and if you are asking the agency things, keep those emails, keep that trail, because it might just be useful for you in the future. Thanks, Kate. Sometimes the rules change, so watch out for version changes of the funding rules through the year. They can issue a new version from time to time, so just be careful of that. It is worth just Googling if you're not sure. Google normally brings up the latest version of the funding rules, but just watch for that. The last 2 years, we've seen the funding rules, the first draft version, if you like, come out in May prior to implementation for the 1st of August, and that's welcome because it gives people a chance to change their processes and procedures, and not so much this year, but certainly the rules that applied from August 2022 had some really significant changes in them. So we needed time. When you get that early version, read it carefully. There is a summary of changes always that comes out, so you know what has changed from the year before, and just really think about how that applies to your business. And be very aware as to what is retrospective. One of the things I come across a lot with providers is they see the new funding rules. There has been a significant change in those new funding rules, and they think that applies to all of their learners. It does not, unless it specifically says that it does. So when the funding rules say those funding rules apply from the 1st of August 2023, and all apprenticeship starts from the 1st of August 2023, if there has been a rule change, that rule does not apply to anybody who started before the 1st of August 2023, unless those rules specifically say so. So in other words, if you've got learners that you've had on program for the last 2 or 3 years and they're still on program, those learners, unless the rule is retrospective, and it will clearly say that, the funding rules for those learners are the funding rules in the year in which they started. So the obvious one is off the job, which changed in August 22 to the 6-hour bit. It's still 20%, but it's 20% based on 30 hours. And if you have learners who started in June 22, they are on 20% of their hours. If you have learners who started in August 22, they are on 20% of a maximum of 30 hours. So just be very careful of those different versions. Thanks, Kate. So let's focus the microscope a little more now, and let's think about the audit itself. So you will be given at least, this slide should say, 2 weeks notice. I have a client who is has just been notified of an audit by the agency, and they are talking about 6 weeks notice. They have offered them a week towards the end of November. So you'll get, it's not like Ofsted, you do get more time, which is welcome. Usually the agency will identify the learners that they want to see, and they will tell you how many and which ones that they will want to audit. And they'll tell you things like how many auditors, how many days. I mean, an audit is typically 4 days, depending on the size of your business. If you're an average provider, it'll probably be 1 or 2 auditors looking at, I don't know, anything up to 50 learners. It can be a mix of current and those who have left. That's an important point as well. If you're aware of compliance issues you may have had in the past, you can't necessarily breathe a huge sigh of relief when all those learners have left thinking they're gone. The agency can go back 6 years and look at learners who have left over that previous 6-year period. They normally start with current learners. Sometimes there are recent past learners in there as well, but just be aware it can be a mix of both current and those who have left. They will want to review all of your evidence, and the evidence is clearly set out in the funding rules. We're going to go through that in a second, whether that's on paper, whether you've got it on Aptem, whether you use a combination of the two. They will want to see all of that. So if your information is stored on Aptem, you will need to give the auditor access to Aptem as an observer so that they can go and interrogate the system. And if they are things that they're not happy about, they may, after the audit or during it, I've known them to extend an audit to give the provider time to provide additional information. If they felt that something has been missing, but the provider says they've got it, you sometimes can get additional time. But certainly there's lots of interaction during the audit. They don't just come in, sit with their heads down for 4 days, go away and write a report. There's lots and lots of interaction with the auditor, asking you questions. Where's this? Where's that? Why did you do that? Etc. 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 So it is an interactive process. If things go a bit wrong and they see common factors, so if they're looking at your current learners and they see a common error, that they can sometimes go back to learners who have left to see whether that was prevalent for how long. If things are particularly bad, they can extrapolate their findings, and they can extrapolate up to all of your learners, and that can determine some clawback. And clawback is where you have to pay the agency money back. And that can be for anything. It's where an auditor is not satisfied that you have the evidence to justify something. So if they find some learners that are not eligible, because they didn't live in the UK for 3 years prior to the apprenticeship start, for example, and that's a common problem, then they can extrapolate the findings of that, and you could end up with the auditor saying, because they haven't lived here for 3 years, they're not eligible to do the apprenticeship. You've drawn down all the funding, you've got to pay it back. One of the worst possible outcomes from an audit, without scaring people, is that if the auditor determines that things are so bad that 100% audit needs to be conducted, in other words, every learner needs to be looked at, then it is unusual for the agency to do that. They will normally tell you, you have to get that done with somebody like KPMG, for example, and you have to pay for it. And then the audit report is shared with you and the agency, and then they determine their findings on that basis. So that's a bit about process and a bit about outcomes. Thanks, Kate. So let's look at some of those evidence requirements. I've talked about evidence a lot, and the E word, evidence, is absolutely crucial. You need to show that you have evidence, as I said, whether it's stored on Aptem, whether it's stored in Lever Arch files, or a combination of the two. However, you have to have evidence. And let's just walk our way through some of these evidence requirements. So learner eligibility. Have they been here for 3 years? What's their date of birth? Are they 16? Do we know, have you evidence that they're going to spend 50% of their working time in England? That's a very interesting rule in these days of people working from home. And the agency are saying that they're going to review that, because it is, in one sense, particularly in the light of the experience we all had in COVID, a bit of a nonsense these days as to where people actually physically are. However, it is still a 50% requirement at the moment, but watch perhaps next year or the year after for that to change. So make sure you look at all of the eligibility stuff. Prior learning, really important aspect this, and it is one of the things that I know auditors tend to focus on. So do you have a skills scan completed by the learner, reviewed by the assessor, coach, tutor, whatever you call them in your business? And that verification bit is really important. The number of providers who do a skills scan and then take as absolute gospel what the learner says without challenging them on it, that is wrong. You must verify your skill scan. So in other words, if you have a skill scan and you ask the learner to score against the knowledge, skills and behaviours on a scale of 1 to 4, which is a good one to have because they can't sit on the fence, and a learner is marking themselves as 4 on quite a lot of categories. In other words, they know it all, and that's your evidence base, and you put them on the apprenticeship, and an auditor comes in and says, hang on a minute, the learner told you they can do a lot of this, and you haven't had that conversation with the learner and moderated that score. So, for example, they score 4 out of 4 for health and safety, and you ask the learner what COSH is or what RIDOR is, and they don't know. Clearly, you moderate that score down. So that's the process that you must go through. So that's what I mean by a verified skill scan. Don't forget, with prior learning, it is not just about qualifications, but their experience. You're about to put on the retail level 2 apprenticeship, somebody who's worked in a shop for 5 years. You need to think about that. They haven't got any qualifications, but they've got 5 years experience working in a retail environment. You must use the ESFA format for RPL calculations. And this again, I still come across some providers who are using their old methodology. That changed over a year ago now. And you have to work out how many hours it takes for all of your off-the-job activity to deliver your apprenticeship. You then have to determine for each part of that apprenticeship how many hours the learner's prior knowledge or experience constitutes, and you then have to determine that as a percentage, and you halve it to reduce the price. It's all in the rules. There's a good example in the funding rules to tell you how to do that, but you must use that methodology. The word must is there, and when the word must appears in the funding rules, you don't have a choice. If it says should or it is recommended, as it says a few times, then that's different. But when it says must, you must. And think very carefully, and this is the subject for a webinar in itself, so I'm not going to dwell on this here, but think about the concept of content, duration and price. The funding rules links them quite closely. So in other words, if you reduce the funding for something, you must reduce that content, you must remove that content, and you must reduce the duration. It's not as easy as that, and there are ways round that as a concept. The most important thing is that you properly reduce the funding you draw down from the agency. If you subsequently decide that, in a 10-module apprenticeship, the learner knows module 1, you can still allow them to sit in on module 1. You just don't claim the funding for it, but it's up to you if they sit there, because the agency are paying for that. The only thing is, in that example, is that they cannot use any evidence of module 1 activities for off the job, because as far as the agency is concerned, they knew that before they started, and it is not part of the apprenticeship. So the thought process is that they sit quietly in the room hearing all the input and all the rest of it, and they don't seriously get going on their apprenticeship until module 2. You cannot use evidence in module 1 if you are not drawing down funding for it. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. I'm just going to do a small demo on the skill scan and RPL options that we have here in Aptem. So we've got a skills radar in Aptem, and it's completely customizable in terms of both the criteria that you want the learner to assess themselves against, as well as the scale that you want them to use. So for example, in this example, I've used the duties from the coaching professional standard, and my scale is a 0 to 6 scale, but when I click into the criteria, I get the details of the scale here, and this is what my learner would see as well. So I could have a 1 to 10 numeric scale, just a basic numeric scale there, or you can give details and give descriptions on what each label means for that learner as well. The occupational duties are listed instead of the full KSBs, and you can customize what you want your skill scan to look like in Aptem. The learner is invited to complete the skills radar during the onboarding process, and that's this blue line here. So we've got the learner assessment in the light blue line. And you can also invite the employer to contribute to this process via a review as well. So we've got the purple line here, which shows the employer assessment. And then like that verified piece that Tony mentioned, we've got the tutor assessment in the dark blue. So the tutor can contribute to this either via a review or via the skills radar screen, which is the screen I'm in now. So for example, if I want to bring this one down, if in conversation with the learner we've decided that they're actually a 1 in this area, I can select the option here and hit save, and then that will bring that option down for me there. Now we also have this notes and file upload mechanism. A learner, employer or tutor can add a note and upload a file to this skills scan section as well. So if you're having a discussion about you know, whether it's a 1 or a 2, then you can maybe note that discussion in here. And similarly, if the learner has some formal qualifications, they could upload that as a file against this particular duty as well. And if you complete all of this in a review, then the skills radar results, so the ones that we've got here, and any notes that you've added will export into your review PDF, which does make it easy for the auditor and to gather all that into your evidence pack as well. As we mentioned, you may have a learner that requires RPL. So they require a reduction in off-the-job hours, funding and length of programme. And we do have an RPL calculator to support you in using that ESFA format. So if I just create a tracker against this learner here, just going to wait for that to load so that I can create that tracker. There we go. So if I just create this RPL calculator, the first thing I get here is my program details prior to the adjustment. So I can check what this should be. So a standard program, a standard learner on this program would follow these start date, end date, and planned off the job hours and duration. And then this is the price for the practical period and the assessment that's in my ILR currently. Previously, in Jane's learning plan, I have gone in and removed 104 hours due to a couple of modules that we had evidence for that she's already completed. So I've removed those from the learning plan, and Aptem remembers this and drags it in to the RPL calculator for me. Of course, at this point, I can override this figure if I want to, but then your off-the-job hours here wouldn't match the off-the-job hours in the learning plan. So it's really important to try and keep those in sync if you can. I can select here to not adjust the duration if I wanted to, if the length of program was still going to be the same. And I can also select to use the funding band maximum for the standard if I don't do that already. And then I get a little summary box here. So it tells me the remaining planned off the job hours, what the percentage is in the off the job hours reduction, and a suggested practical period, end date, and practical period price here for me. Again, I can make changes to these details here. So if I had a particular agreement with an employer, I might make a change to the practical period price here. But if I leave it as it is, or if I make a change, once I hit create and I process this tracker, these changes will go into the ILR for me. So I've made sure that my learning plan's updated because I've removed the 104 hours. I've made sure my ILR is updated, my total negotiated price is updated, as well as my practical period end date. But also doing it via the tracker means that I've got a really good audit trail of everything that happened and who processed that. I've got evidence that it's been thought about, it's being considered, and then obviously it makes all the changes for you in the ILR as well, which is a really useful tool. And I'm going to hand back over to you, Tony.
Thanks, Freya. Thanks very much. Kate, if we can have the next slide, which you've got, brilliant. Okay, so moving on, conscious of time. So other key evidence requirements, learning support. From the 1st of August, it's now a requirement that you have conducted a learning support screening exercise for every single apprenticeship start. That's a little changing the rules that sneaked through, and a lot of people haven't spotted it. Doesn't specify what that should look like, doesn't specify how long, but you must have done that. And it can be self-screening by the learner, which you then check on. That's fine. If you are drawing down learning support for a learner, additional learning support, then obviously you need to evidence each month of the need for that continued support. Functional skills, again, could be the subject of a webinar all on its own. First of all, you need to evidence the need, so there needs to be some analysis of all of that initially, some part of the initial assessment, probably a diagnostic test as well. You need to evidence details as to how that is being delivered. So is it being delivered on a one-to-one basis, on group basis, online, face-to-face, how? And of course, if you have learners who are exempt from functional skills, and that maybe the majority of them, then you need to have your GCSE certificates for English and Maths or equivalent. And also you need to be able to evidence their employment arrangements. So you need to at least have seen and evidence that you have seen the details of their employment, that they're on a PAYE scheme, in other words, that they are employed, not self-employed, and that they are being paid the lawful wage for their status. And just be slightly careful of the apprenticeship minimum wage, because if they're over 19, that can only be paid for year 1 of the apprenticeship. So yeah, again, just be careful of some of those particular rules. Thanks, Kate. And off the job, and Freya's going to show us a little bit in a second about Aptem and that. Make sure you've properly calculated it. Again, the number of people I see who forget the statutory 28-day holiday requirement. So just be very careful that you take out your 5.6 weeks for that for every year. As Freya's already touched on, really, make sure that your off the job hours, at least at the beginning of the apprenticeship, are consistent. And by that I mean the planned hours that are on the ILR are the planned hours that are in the apprenticeship agreement, are the planned hours that are in the training plan. Now, we accept that the training plan and apprenticeship agreement during the course of the apprenticeship can change. That may trigger a change in the off-the-job hours. You cannot change the planned hours on the ILR. Well, you can, but you have the sole justification is that originally it was an administrative error. So whilst all your hours will be nicely in sync at the beginning, it may be as the learner progresses throughout the apprenticeship that what's on the ILR planned hours and what you have in Aptem might be 2 different figures, because you've changed the training plan and you now require them to do more off the job hours. So think about that. Make sure that your off the job is well documented in your training plan. Make sure it's mapped against the KSBs in the standard, and that both in terms of the planned and the actual. So in your off the job log, make sure there's reference to the KSBs when learners are logging activity. Evening and weekends, unless they work normally evenings and weekends, so that may be in the care sector, for example, but normally activities logged during evenings and weekends are not allowed. Remember, it's the learner's normal working hours that off-the-job activity must be recorded. And if you find you get to Gateway and the learner's completed everything and their actual hours are less than they're planned, and that shouldn't be a surprise because you should be monitoring that throughout the process, then you are required to sign a special statement with the employer and the learner to say that despite the fact they haven't achieved their planned hours, all of the training has been undertaken. I'm asked a lot about training plans when you update them, and you know, the funding rules are definitely moving us to a world where training plans are no longer just the same training plan for everybody on a cohort, but are individualized training plans. And certainly as people move throughout the apprenticeship, you do need to change and reflect their new training planned activity for people who perhaps are falling a bit behind. And the key times, and people say, well, when do I change it? Do I change it every time we have a progress review? No. you change it when there is a significant change to what the learner is doing or when they're going to do it. So if a learner starts to fall behind and you know they're not going to achieve all their learning by the original practical period end date, and you have to extend that practical period end date, then you need to reissue the training plan. Or if you suddenly decide, for example, during the course of the apprenticeship that they need to do functional skills, they may be have been exempt, but you've identified an issue. I would then expect you to change the training plan then too. And make sure, of course, that all of these things are signed by everybody. Yes, I know you've now got the 42-day period to get them signed. Do not rely on that. Do not. That is supposed to be sort of by exception. So make sure in an ideal world that all of these things are signed before or at least on the day that the learner starts. Freya, I think it's over to you.
Thanks, Tony. Just to bring in my screen again. In Aptem, we have this performance dashboard, which shows you a number of different cards to keep on track of things. But the one we're interested in here is this off-the-job hours card at the bottom. So it shows you insufficient hours planned. So if you've got learners where they're not meeting the minimum, then this is obviously a huge red flag and we need to deal with this. And it also shows you who's behind target on their off-the-job hours. So if you've planned 100 hours to happen in the first 3 months and the learner's not kept up with that, then this is a really good tool to keep you on track of that as you go through the program, so it's not a surprise when you get to the end. If we look at this insufficient hours planned drop down, we can see in this table that we've got the minimum required and then what's planned in the ILR and what their forecast is as well. So the forecast is a sum of the completed hours in completed components in the learning plan and planned hours in incomplete components in the learning plan. So at the start of the program, that's just what's in the learning plan. So if I look at this for my learner Gina here, on their individual dashboard, they also have this off-the-job hours card. I can see my minimum required is 454 and I've only got 401 planned in the ILR and in the forecast, which is basically the learning plan at this point. These figures are going to pull through to my training plan. So obviously I need to rectify this as soon as I can, so that when the learner, the employer and the provider sign the training plan, that's all correct and they're signing for the appropriate amount of hours that meets the minimum required and not the one that's below that as well. So it's crucial to get those right at this point. And I'm going to hand back to you, Tony.
Great, thanks very much indeed. So the next bit of evidence that you will be required to produce is around progress reviews. And there is now a requirement that there are at least 4 per year completed. That's a subtle change as well in the current year. The previous year, it said they had to be every 12 weeks. Progress reviews need to be undertaken. Well, nearly every provider I know does them on a set frequency, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, whatever. And that is fine in a way, but arguably they should be done when the learner needs them to be done. And the agency recognise this, so hence they've said a minimum 4 per year. They need to be signed, learner, employer, yourselves. And there is now, and again, a much more fixed requirement that the employer, the line manager here, is attending the vast majority of progress reviews. If you have a problem with that and your employers are not attending, you need to really be sorting that out, because that's not only a compliance requirement, but Ofsted will not look kindly on employers who don't attend progress reviews either. Where they can't attend, and it's recognised they can't attend 100% of the time, then they are at least asked to contribute in advance, usually, to that learner's review. So think very clearly about your progress reviews. The clue is in the title with them. They're not a tick box process. They are supposed to be a serious conversation between learner, employer, and yourselves. So do yours amount to that? I'll leave that question with you. The other thing you have to evidence, and this is important too, is eligible cost breakdown. In other words, there are certain things you can draw down funding for, and there are things that you can't. The 5 key areas that you can, and it's in para 86 of the 23-24 funding rules. Initial assessments, what the funding rules calls off the job, that's slightly misleading. It also means on the job as well as off the job. materials and consumables, peripheral costs, so that's progress reviews on program assessment, not EPA, of course, that's a separate cost. And then the final category is government management of the program. So they should be clearly articulated, clearly broken down. The total goes into TMP1 on the ILR. They should be agreed with the employer. I wonder how many providers do that. You should be clear as to what your profit element is. So that should be articulated separately. And of course, if you are an employer provider or a provider that has their own apprentices, you are not allowed to make a profit on your own employees. Freya.
Thank you. I'm going to talk a little bit about the reviews element of that section. Reviews are used for a number of things in Aptem, and you can use them almost like forms to kind of check things off and get things signed by employers, learners and tutors or admins as well. The first review that we've got here is an eligibility review. So once a learner completes onboarding, we need to make sure that we do an eligibility check, and we can do that via a review. With all our reviews in Aptem, they're customizable. So if I go into this one, we can see that we've got provider questions, and these are all custom questions that we've just created. We've got employer questions, so they are confirming the eligibility here as well. And then we've got some questions, some sections, sorry, that are created from Aptem, so they're just out of the box Aptem sections like the skills radar and the individual support needs and requirements section, which then pulls into the training plan to detail the description of any additional support needs and then actions that you're going to take to support them as well. We also can schedule progress reviews. So here I've got a learner where we've scheduled progress reviews at the appropriate intervals over the course of the year, so avoids any risk of a tutor or a learner or an employer saying, oh, I didn't know that I had to do these progress reviews, I didn't know when they were coming up. And we can again customize them, so we can use Aptem's preset elements, or we can use our own custom questions to decide what we want to ask the learner and what's going to help us see progress for this learner as well. So I've got some learner questions and comments in here, and I can customize all these to make sure that I'm getting what I need out of this as a tutor, which is really helpful. And then with all of our reviews, when we hit finish as an admin, they're sent off to the learner, the employer, and the administrator themselves for signature. And that all saves as a PDF, which again can go in your evidence pack, and it just means that you can get signatures on those PDF documents, and makes it easier for audit as well.
Thanks, Freya. Okay, thank you, Kate. So moving on quickly to the final two slides with aspects of evidence requirements. Additional payments. So if you are receiving incentive payments that are supposed to be passed on to the employer, they have to be paid on time, specifically mentioned in the funding rules. It's really bad news if an employer complains to the agency that they've not had their payments. So you don't want that to happen. Endpoint assessment, there has to be a written agreement with the endpoint assessment organization and signed statements regarding the employment status of the learner with the EPAO. And of course now, as a training provider, you have a bit more control over which EPAO it is in practice. That's always been the case, but now even in theory, that is the case. It is less, you make a recommendation to the employer and they accept it, so that's fine. In terms of contract requirements, one that's sometimes overlooked is the agency expects you to have a commercial agreement or a contract for services, something like that, with the employer. So that sets out the terms of the service that you are providing to that employer. That is an expectation of the funding rules. There's no template for that. AELP have usefully got one if you're a member of AELP. But it is expected that that will be in place and reviewed regularly. It is surprising the number of those that I asked to see when a training provider asked me to get involved with them, and it's 5 or 6 years old. Auditor will not look kindly on that. The apprenticeship agreement between the employer and the learner, the training plan we've talked about, and any co-investment arrangement. So if the employer is not a levy payer, then you need to make sure that there's proper arrangements documented in place in an agreement regarding their 5% contribution, how often you're going to bill it, for example. Again, these days that is entirely up to you as a provider. It used to be prescribed, it's now not. So you can charge it all up front or drip feed it or do whatever. Just be slightly careful of charging it all up front. If the learner then leaves, you will be expected to pay some of that back. Thanks, Kate. And the final slide, in terms of evidence, focuses on where there's a change of circumstance. So again, you need to evidence breaks in learning and be very clear and very specific around that. And watch out for the rule that now, again, a bit of a tweak for 23-24, talks about if there is no evidence of learning for a month. It was 4 weeks in 22-23. And some of us pointed out that that's a nonsense, because a learner could have learning on the 1st of the month and the 30th of the month and still require there to be a bill. So the agency have seen the error of their ways there and have changed it to a calendar month, which ties in with the ILR, which is fine. But if there's no evidence of learning for that month, you are supposed to put that learner on a break in learning, even if they're learning again the following day. So just be conscious of that. Clearly, redundancy, there's a whole section in the funding rules about all of that. Ditto maternity or paternity, and what happens if the standard changes and there is a new version of the standard, and what you should do if you're moving learners from one version to another. And of course, we all know that there is a veritable encyclopedia now of requirements around the rules for subcontracting, what you have to do before, during, and after, and it's almost a webinar content in itself. So just be very aware of those if you subcontract, because again, I know auditors are looking very closely at providers who subcontract and making sure that you comply with all of those rules. Freya.
Thanks, Tony. I'm going to rattle through this, just conscious of time, but we do have a webinar on process automation trackers on a help centre, so please do look at that if you need extra help on this. So we have a number of trackers in Aptem which can help you process and manage these changes of circumstances to make sure that your ILR remains up to date. I'm going to demonstrate this with a break in learning tracker, so I've selected the type here. I'm going to select the reason for the break. So let's say this is a maternity break. And then I can select the last learning date here as well. Now, Aptem tells me when the last recorded learning happened in Aptem. So obviously it's worthwhile checking that and making sure that aligns with your records as well. But that's a really good indicator of the last time you have evidence of this person learning. So we can add the last learning date in here. We can also add an expected return date and a next review date. These ones will put calendar tasks into the tutor's calendar to remind them that they have a learner who is expected to come back. So they'll be returning at some point, and the review date, they maybe need to get in touch with the learner and make sure everything is looking good for them to return. I can send a message to the learner and to the tutor if I wanted to let them know that we've approved their break in learning, and I can also upload supporting documents here as well if I had anything that I wanted to upload and save to this tracker. Once I then process this tracker, this will then update the ILR to reflect the break in learning with the dates that I've entered in here. And it will also change the learner's status, so everything stays up to date within Aptem, and it locks the learning plan so they can't go in and actually complete any learning when they're supposed to be on a break. We can also use trackers to return the learner from the break, withdraw the learner, change employer or working conditions, and apply learning support funding amongst other processes. So do check out that webinar if you are interested in any of those ones. And the final thing on trackers to say is that they enable you to keep a detailed audit trail for any changes of circumstances, and ensures that if they're processed properly, that the ILR will be updated and in sync with the learner's actual circumstances, and make sure that everything's all in sync, which is great. I'm going to hand back to you, Tony.
Thanks, Freya. Thank you very much. Kate, if we can have the next slide. So, final section, just 2 or 3 more slides, just to quickly go through. When you're gathering evidence, document it. If you're using Aptem, then that obviously collects a lot of information for you. There's a self-evident audit trail within the system, so it's a lot easier to do than if you're trying to do all of this stuff on paper. But make sure you have evidence. It has to be first-hand, okay? It has to be robust. It has to be obviously relevant to the learner. You will be surprised the number of times I go into a system and see things that don't relate to that learner stored against that learner. All sorts of potential issues around that, but that requires you to be very accurate. It's relevant to the standard, and that evidence is very verifiable. And by that I mean that it has clearly not been made up. There's an audit trail supporting it. Thank you, Kate. I'm often asked, how do I know if I'm going to get an audit? I mean, with Ofsted, you can usually have a pretty good guess as to when you might be inspected, to within a few months. Auditing, you can't. The agency have a both random and risk-based balanced approach to providers who they inspect. I know of providers who have been delivering apprenticeships for 8 years and have never been inspected. I know of another who's been doing it for 5 years and has been inspected 3 times. So there is a degree of randomness, there is a degree of risk. Some of the little red flags that will alert them are on your screen. Providers who always claim 100% of funding. That is the biggest red flag, because that tells the agency you are not doing your recognition of prior learning properly. There are some standards with a mandatory qualification where the provider is obliged to provide 100% of the curriculum and the apprenticeship. But that's a comparative few. The vast majority are not like that. So think very carefully. If you always claim 100% of funding, that is wrong. I'll tell you, it is wrong. You should not be doing that. A provider who makes lots of changes to the ILR on a regular basis, another red flag. Changes the off-the-job planned hours. As I said earlier, on the ILR, there's only one reason to do that, and that is you've made an administrative error. So presumably you can do it once. It's difficult to argue you've made an administrative error twice. So if you're trying to change the planned hours on the ILR, it's almost best not to. Off the job hours less than planned, we've talked about that. If there's lots of these certificates that you have to sign with the employer and the learner, and frequent breaks in learning. That is also, you'll be amazed that some providers have loads of breaks in learning. So just be very careful and try to manage and control that as much as you possibly can. Thanks, Kate. Common mistakes, and I still have some contacts amongst auditors in the agency from my old days, and I talk to them on a fairly regular basis, and these are the things that they see on a common basis. No signatures. Signatures are really, really important because they are confirmation that something happened. A progress review actually happened because the learner and employer have signed it, and it wasn't just made up by somebody sitting at a desk. So signatures, really, really, really important. Wrong price on the ILR or on the paperwork, on the training plan, on the employer agreement, wherever else it is stated. So the TMP price doesn't tally from the start. Again, that's a thing that is dead easy to get right. Just make sure that you do. They've not used the agency methodology for calculating prior learning. Again, really important that you document the hours it takes you to deliver and the hours you have deducted from the learner. Off the job, not related to KSBs, it relates to something else, all very nice, but it has nothing to do with the apprenticeship standard. I attended a charity football match at the weekend, and that's an actual example I saw a couple of weeks ago. Off the job activity takes place evenings and weekends when the learner is not contracted to work evenings and weekends. And why that's important is that you don't want a learner to get to Gateway, or just before they're about to get to Gateway, you are audited and an auditor wipes out, tens or hundreds of hours because it's all been logged on a Sunday night. So just be very careful about that, because that learner will then not be able to go to Gateway, and you'll be faced with the embarrassing situation of having to go back to the learner and the employer and say, you're going to make up all those hours now because we can't count those. So just make sure that you're really on the ball with all of that. An organisation that never revises its training plans. Again, that's something that auditors will look for. Insufficient evidence of learning in a month. So you're drawing down funding, but there is hardly any evidence of learning for that. Or infrequent or non-existent progress reviews. Key things there. Okay, thanks, Kate. So you can do a lot yourself here. Have a planned approach, as I said at the beginning. Make sure you have a compliance framework, a compliance plan. Use the agency reports that you get, the DSAT reports and all of those reports that you will have access to identify errors, identify things that aren't right. Audit compliance is everybody's responsibility in the business, not just the person with compliance in their title. It's everybody's responsibility, and it should be, if you like, a core value, a core KPI in the business. Conduct regular internal checks yourself. Have your own internal audit regime. Doesn't matter how big or small you are, you need to be doing that. And arrange for a mock audit. There are organisations, like, dare I say it, my own, but there are many others available, who will come and do a mock audit for you and will highlight to you where you are doing things perhaps not as correctly as you should be before the agency walks through the door, and you then have time to put that right. Thank you. Kate.
We were going to do a quick demo, which we have a video of for the reporting elements in Aptem for this section, but because we're running out of time, we're going to move straight to questions, and we're going to send you that video after, so you won't miss out. Don't worry. We're going to go straight to the Q&A.
Hey, thanks very much, everybody, for raising questions. We'll get straight to it. So one for Tony. Will the auditors want to speak directly to a learner?
No, they don't normally speak directly to learners, no.
Great. Would the four progress, in the interest of time, thank you. Would the four progress reviews include the eligibility and suitability review at the beginning and possibly the EPA gateway review, or are they separate? So possibly more than 4 reviews would be needed?
No, the progress reviews are something in their own right. So you will be expected at the beginning to have a conversation. Many providers call it the training plan call, where you talk to the learner and the employer about exactly what you expect the learner to do, what they're going to be doing. You go through the program, you brief them on all aspects of the apprenticeship. Then there are at least in a year 4 progress reviews, and then you have your gateway review at the end. So progress reviews, training plan call or induction call, and gateway review are different.
Thank you. Another one for you, Tony. Where is the requirement in the rules to map the off-the-job hours to the KSBs? They couldn't see this in the template provided by the ESFA.
It is there. It is a requirement. It's not specifically phrased as such in the rules, but the rules do say that off-job activity must match the requirements of the apprenticeship. The requirements of the apprenticeship are clearly articulated in the apprenticeship standard. Therefore, by default, you have to show that both the planned activity and the actual activity is at least linked to at least one of the knowledge, skills, or behaviour statements.
Perfect. One for you, Freya. How can we use Aptem effectively to monitor where learners do not have evidence of learning in any given month?
Great question. The progress dashboard, which I showed briefly, and I'm just going to bring back up super quickly, shows a behind metric as well. So hopefully you can see that, but we've got this progress overview card here. And when a learner is behind, it means that they've not completed the task that they were supposed to by that time. So obviously it doesn't automatically say they've not completed active learning in this month. But if we click into this option, we can see a list of the learners who are falling behind. If this is going to load for me, it shows you in this column here the number of overdue activities that they have, and then you can go into those overdue activities and see, has this been a calendar month since this learner has completed anything? How many overdue activities have we got? And if we take off that filter, we can see in the learning plan if they have completed anything. In this case, the learner's not completed anything since the 1st of August, so they definitely should be been put on a break in learning in this case. But we can use that progress overview metric in the dashboard to help us keep track of that.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Freya. One for you, Tony. We've had a couple of questions around giving auditors access to Aptem. I wondered if you could comment on sort of best practice around that.
Yes, I mean, if you are using Aptem as your system, and as we've seen from the demos today, Aptem will do pretty much everything for you. It's all there. It's a great system. You've got your audit trail. You've got your evidence base. And it's fine if you don't have paper, and there are some providers who are almost paperless these days. Everything is on Aptem or an equivalent system. You will need to give an auditor access to that. And I'm not completely familiar whether Aptem has an observer category that you can use. I'm sure either Kate or Freya will tell me yes or no on that one. But you clearly want to give an auditor access so they can't change anything. Clearly, you don't want them, inadvertently changing a record or something, but they will need access to everything that you have about that learner on the system. They have a legal right to do that. That's part of your contract with the ESFA that you sign as a training provider. You don't have to worry about GDPR rules because they are covered with all of that. So that's what you need to do. You need to give them access.
Just to come in on that as well, Tony, we do have a mechanism to give auditors or offset inspectors, anyone external, access to Aptem. So you'd set them up with an admin account and restrict their access via groups. And we have a help centre article, which I will dig out and we can send out with the rest of the information for this one, which shows you exactly how to do that. And that would be the case for Ofsted, ESFA, or any other external auditors to come in.
Excellent, good.
Brilliant, thank you very much. We have had quite a few questions going through, so apologies, we're not going to get a chance to get to all of them on this call, but we could probably do one or two more. So for Tony, could you please advise on when funding and off the job is reduced due to RPL, i.e. 3 modules and the apprentice falls below the total minimum off the job requirement as they have less planned off the job than others in the cohort? They do, however, have the same start and end date as others in the cohort.
Yes, if I think I understand the question, you do have to be very careful about minimum duration here. So, and if in reducing if you have a learner if you're doing a 12-month apprenticeship, and you're delivering that, say, over 13 months, and you have a learner who has a significant amount of RPL, that probably means they are not able to do the apprenticeship, because you cannot, if they've got 20%, or arguably if they've got any more than about 10% RPL in that circumstance, they would probably, because an auditor would say, you've cut the duration, that takes it below what they're actually doing, you will be doing in less than 12 months. Therefore, that is not a valid apprenticeship. So you do need to be careful on short-term apprenticeships around that duration point. I think that's what the question was about.
Brilliant, thanks, Tony. And then on the requirement to state the profit element separately, is this a change?
No, but it's just good practice, really, because an auditor will want to know in pound note terms what your cost base is for those 5 categories I talked about, and that's in para 86. And there will therefore be a gap between those costs and the TMP1 price, because the TMP1 price includes your profit element. It's just good practice to show that profit element. You can't hide it, so it's just good practice to have that listed, really.
Brilliant, thank you very much. I think we should probably, we've run over obviously time-wise, so we should probably call it there. Thank you very much, everybody, for your questions. Anything specifically related to Aptem, we will get back to you separately on. Thank you very much for Tony and Freya for all of your insights on the session. Thank you to everybody for joining. We hope you found it useful. We will be sharing a copy of this recording in the coming days, as well as that additional 10-minute video Freya mentioned. I shall be walking you through some of the dashboards that can be used to extract information to use in an audit that are available in Aptem. So do make sure to take a look at that too when that comes through.
And Kate, I'm quite happy for the questions we haven't had time to answer. I'm quite happy to do a written response and for you to send those out if that would help.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Tony. That would be brilliant.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Thank you to Tony and Freya.
Thanks very much, everyone. Good luck.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Kate.